The Taylor house stood like a rotting corpse at the edge of a forgotten road, its windows like black eyes staring out into the suffocating night. The structure had been abandoned for nearly a century, its past haunted by gruesome tales of demonic possession and inexplicable deaths. But tonight, the special investigation team had been sent here with a singular goal: uncover the truth behind the mysterious murders and disappearances that had plagued the area for decades. Agent Ryder, a hardened investigator with a penchant for dark humor, led the new team. His hand gripped the door handle of the decrepit van as they rolled to a stop in front of the dilapidated house. The team, 5 strong, shuffled out in the freezing night, their breath visible in the crisp air. The trees around them swayed unnaturally, creaking and groaning as though whispering secrets to the night. "Well, doesn't this place just scream welcome home?" Ryder quipped, adjusting his pack. His joke fell flat. No one laughed. The oppressive atmosphere weighed on them like an invisible hand. Even as they unloaded their ghost hunting equipment, EMF detectors, infrared cameras, spirit boxes, the air felt thick with something unseen. Agent Monroe, their tech expert, looked up at the house. "It's like this place is alive, waiting." Ryder shrugged. "Then let's not keep it waiting." The moment they crossed the threshold into the house, the temperature dropped dramatically. Ice-cold air sank into their bones. The wooden floor creaked beneath their boots as they entered the musty darkness. The smell of decay and rot clung to everything, mingling with the faint metallic tang of something far more sinister. They split into pairs, Ryder and Monroe heading upstairs, while Agents Drake and Simmons took the ground floor. The 5th member, Agent Cole, went outside to survey the surrounding woods. Just as Ryder began setting up equipment in one of the upstairs rooms, Monroe stiffened. "Do you hear that?" Ryder cocked his head. Faint scratching sounds came from behind the walls, like something with claws burrowing its way through the wood. They exchanged uneasy glances as the scratching grew louder, moving around them, circling the room. Suddenly, the lights in the room flickered and then went out entirely. Monroe swore under his breath, fumbling for a flashlight, but Ryder was focused on something else. A figure standing at the end of the hallway, barely visible in the dim glow of their equipment. "Monroe," Ryder whispered, his voice trembling with dread. "We're not alone." The figure moved closer, its form shifting and distorting, as if not bound by physical reality. Ryder's heart pounded in his chest. It was tall, unnaturally tall, with elongated limbs and hollow eyes that gleamed with malicious intent. The Shadowman. Without warning, the door to the room slammed shut with a deafening bang. Ryder lunged for it, yanking on the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The scratching intensified, now all around them, as if the walls themselves were alive. The lights flickered back on, but the Shadowman was gone. Only the claw marks on the walls remained, gouged deep into the wood. Monroe backed up, his face pale. "We need to get out of here, now." Ryder nodded, his voice grim. "This is just the beginning." Downstairs, Drake and Simmons combed through the darkened halls of the Taylor house. The faint sounds of scratching echoed from upstairs, but they focused on the unsettling basement door ahead of them. It hung open slightly, the stairs leading down into an abyss of pitch-black darkness. Simmons aimed his flashlight into the stairwell. Creepy doesn't even begin to cover this. Drake was already halfway down the stairs, ignoring the growing sense of dread. "Come on, let's get this over with." They descended into the basement, the air thickening with every step. The smell of rot and something far worse assaulted their senses, something feral. The beam of their flashlights cut through the darkness, illuminating a vast, empty space filled with discarded furniture, broken crates, and old symbols scrawled in faded red on the walls. "What the hell?" Simmons muttered, pointing to one of the symbols. "Looks like some kind of ritual. Something went down here." As they moved deeper into the basement, they noticed fresh claw marks along the stone floor. It wasn't long before they heard the sound. Low growls, guttural and unnatural, vibrating from the shadows. And then, from the far end of the room, they emerged. Crawlers, distorted, emaciated figures with 2 long limbs and eyes that gleamed with hunger. They skittered along the ground on all 4s, their twisted bodies moving unnaturally fast. Simmons froze in place, his flashlight trembling in his hand. "Oh God!" Drake raised his weapon. Shoot! They opened fire, but the crawlers were too fast. One leaped, sinking its claws into Drake's leg, pulling him down as he screamed. Blood sprayed across the floor. Simmons backed away in horror, but it was too late. The crawlers swarmed, their screeching filling the basement as they tore into their prey. Upstairs, Ryder heard the screams. Ryder bolted down the stairs, Monroe hot on his heels. The screams coming from the basement sent icy waves of dread through his body. He knew that whatever had happened down there wasn't natural. As they reached the ground floor, Ryder nearly collided with Simmons, who burst out of the basement door. Blood splattered across his face. His eyes were wide with terror, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Drake, he's gone," Simmons stammered. "The crawlers, they're everywhere." Ryder grabbed Simmons by the shoulders, forcing him to focus. "How many?" "Too many," Simmons choked. "We can't stop them." They tore him apart. A chill ran down Ryder's spine. Monroe moved past them, aiming his flashlight down into the basement. The dim beam flickered over the stone steps, revealing deep claw marks etched into the floor. Blood smeared the walls, and the distant sounds of skittering echoed through the air, growing closer. "They're coming up," Monroe muttered. Without hesitation, Ryder slammed the basement door shut and slid a heavy bookshelf in front of it. It wouldn't hold long, but it would buy them a few precious moments. "We need to regroup," Ryder said, his voice firm despite the rising fear. "We're not equipped to handle this many crawlers." Simmons wiped his face, still shaking. "What the hell are these things? I've never seen anything like them." "They're ancient," Monroe whispered, his face pale. "Predatory. And this house, it's like a magnet for them." Suddenly, the door to the basement shook violently as something on the other side slammed against it. A loud, guttural screech reverberated through the wood, followed by a chorus of otherworldly howls. The crawlers were trying to get in. "We can't stay here," Monroe said, backing away from the door. "They'll tear this place apart." Ryder nodded, his mind racing. "We need to get outside, regroup with Cole, and call for backup." As they moved toward the front entrance, the hallway lights flickered again, casting distorted shadows along the walls. The house groaned, as though it were alive, shifting beneath their feet. Ryder couldn't shake the feeling that the Taylor house wasn't just a haunted location. It was a trap. When they reached the front door, it wouldn't budge. Ryder pulled at it with all his strength, but it was as if the house itself refused to let them leave. "Damn it!" Ryder swore, slamming his fist against the wood. The walls seemed to close in around them, the air thickening with malice. Behind them, the basement door groaned, the crawler's claws scratching furiously at the wood. It wouldn't hold much longer. Monroe glanced at the second-floor staircase. "We can go up. There might be another way out through the attic." Ryder hesitated but nodded. "It's our best shot." The three of them rushed up the stairs, just as the basement door exploded off its hinges. The crawlers poured into the hallway, their twisted forms screeching in unison as they scuttled after them. Ryder turned back just in time to see one of the creatures leap onto the staircase, its eyes gleaming with hunger. "Move!" Ryder shouted, pushing Simmons forward. As they reached the top of the stairs, Monroe slammed the door to the second floor behind them. But they all knew it wouldn't be long before the crawlers found a way through. They had only moments to figure out their next move. The second floor was in worse shape than the first, with peeling wallpaper and broken furniture scattered everywhere. A thick layer of dust covered everything, as if the room had been untouched for decades. The air was heavy, suffocating, and the faint sound of whispers floated through the hall, like voices from the past. Monroe scanned the area with his flashlight. "We have to find the attic entrance. There's got to be a way out through the roof." As they moved deeper into the hallway, the atmosphere became colder. Ryder's breath came out in visible puffs as they passed by old family portraits hanging on the walls, their eyes following them with unnerving intensity. Suddenly, Simmons froze, his eyes locked on one of the portraits. Did that just move? Ryder turned to look. The portrait was of a man, his face stern and expressionless. But as Ryder watched, the man's eyes blinked slowly, before his mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. The lights flickered, and when they came back on, the figure in the painting was gone. "Jesus Christ!" Mohovi spirited. This place is cursed. A loud bang came from the door behind them. The crawlers were breaking through. Ryder grabbed Simmons and pulled him forward. We don't have time for this. Move. They sprinted down the hallway, searching frantically for the attic entrance. At the far end, Monroe spotted a rickety pull-down ladder hanging from the ceiling. There! He shouted, reaching up to grab the rope. With a swift yank, the ladder descended, and they scrambled up into the attic, just as the crawlers burst through the second-floor door. The attic was dark and suffocatingly hot, filled with dust-covered relics from another time. As Monroe and Simmons caught their breath, Ryder noticed something strange. A large, ornate mirror at the far end of the room, its surface cracked but still intact. It seemed out of place, too pristine compared to the rest of the decayed surroundings. Before Ryder could comment, a low, guttural voice echoed through the attic. You shouldn't have come here. The mirror shimmered, and a figure began to materialize within it, tall, shadowy, and watching them with glowing red eyes. The shadowy figure inside the mirror loomed larger, its red eyes glowing with a malevolent hunger. Ryder's heart pounded as he instinctively backed away, pulling Monroe and Simmons with him. The temperature in the attic plummeted, their breaths turning to frost in the still air. That's not a ghost, Monroe whispered, gripping his flashlight tighter. That's something worse. Before Ryder could respond, the figure in the mirror stepped forward. Its distorted body pushed against the glass like it was a thin membrane, the surface rippling as if the mirror were made of water. The creature's long, clawed hand reached out, and then with a sickening crack, the glass shattered outward. The force of the explosion threw them to the ground, shards of glass raining down like daggers. Ryder shielded his face, gritting his teeth as the sinister figure fully emerged from the mirror. It stood before them, towering over the room, its twisted form barely human. I am bound to this house, it hissed, its voice deep and ancient. And now so are you. Simmons scrambled backward, his eyes wide with terror. What the hell is that? A shadowman, Monroe said, his voice trembling. It's been feeding off the souls of everyone who's died here. The shadowman advanced, its footsteps unnaturally silent on the wooden floorboards. Ryder's mind raced. They couldn't fight this thing, not with the equipment they had. It was something older, darker, more powerful than anything they had ever encountered. As the shadowman reached for Simmons, its fingers twisting unnaturally in the air, Ryder grabbed a nearby iron rod from the debris. Without thinking, he swung it at the creature, the impact sending a shockwave of cold through his body. To his surprise, the shadowman recoiled, hissing in pain. Ryder realized that the iron had actually hurt it. Monroe, iron works, Ryder shouted, gripping the rod tighter. Monroe grabbed a rusted iron lantern from the floor and hurled it at the shadowman. The creature screamed as the lantern made contact, the ancient metal burning its smoky form. For a moment, it wavered, the red eyes dimming. We have to get out of here, Ryder said. Now. As they backed toward the attic door, the shadowman began to recover. Its eyes flared with anger, and the walls of the attic trembled as though the house itself was reacting to the creature's rage. Go, Ryder urged. I'll cover you. Simmons and Monroe scrambled down the ladder, and Ryder took one last swing with the iron rod before following them. As he climbed down, he could hear the shadowman's voice, low and furious. You cannot escape, it whispered. This house belongs to me, and so do you. Ryder hit the floor just as the ladder snapped upward, sealing the attic shut behind them. The house groaned around them, and a heavy silence fell. We need a plan, Monroe said, his voice tight with fear. We can't fight that thing for long. Not without more iron. Agreed, Ryder said, catching his breath. But first, we need to regroup with Cole and find a way to get out of this house alive. The floor creaked beneath their feet as they moved cautiously through the second floor, their senses on high alert. The shadowman wasn't the only threat lurking in the Taylor house. Ryder could still hear the skittering of the crawlers in the walls, their claws scratching, waiting. Monroe's flashlight flickered, casting long shadows that twisted unnervingly along the walls. We're not alone, he whispered. The house is watching us. Ryder didn't doubt it. The air itself felt oppressive, as though the house were a living, breathing entity, one that didn't want them to leave. Suddenly, A loud bang echoed through the hallway, followed by a bone-chilling screech. Ryder spun around, his flashlight beam landing on the source of the noise. The door at the end of the hall had been flung open, and beyond it was a staircase leading down to the basement. But something was wrong. The air near the doorway shimmered like heat waves, and the temperature dropped sharply. "Stay back," Ryder warned. "It's a trap." Monroe peered into the distance, squinting against the eerie glow. "Do you see that? There's something moving down there." A figure stood at the bottom of the staircase, partially obscured by the shadows. At first, Ryder thought it might be one of their team members, maybe Cole, but as the figure stepped into the dim light, his blood ran cold. It wasn't human. Its body was twisted and hunched, with unnaturally long limbs and skin stretched tight over its bones. Its eyes glowed a sickly yellow, and a guttural growl rumbled from its throat. Ryder recognized the creature instantly. "A skinwalker," he breathed. The skinwalker lunged up the stairs with terrifying speed, its claws scraping against the wood. Ryder barely had time to react before the creature was upon them. He swung the iron rod, catching the skinwalker across the chest. It howled in pain, but didn't stop. It slashed at Monroe, its claws slicing through his jacket and leaving deep gashes in his arm. "Get back!" Ryder shouted, shoving Monroe aside and jabbing the rod into the creature's torso. The iron sizzled against its flesh, and the skinwalker recoiled, retreating down the stairs with a shriek of fury. But Ryder knew it wouldn't stay gone for long. "We need to find Cole," Ryder said, urgency in his voice. "And fast. The house is turning against us." As they hurried down the hallway, Ryder couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. The Taylor house was no ordinary haunted building. It was a malevolent force, feeding on the terror of its victims. And they were next on the menu. The walls of the Taylor house groaned, shifting ominously as Ryder and Monroe rushed down the hallway, the distant sound of scratching and growling echoing behind them. Every creak underfoot, every shadow flickering in their peripheral vision made their hearts race faster. "Do you hear that?" Monroe whispered, his voice barely audible above the pounding of their footsteps. Ryder slowed down, straining to listen. At first, there was nothing but the eerie silence of the house. But then it came, a low, guttural whisper seeping from the very walls around them. "Come closer, join us." The voices were faint, distorted, and bone-chilling. Ryder's pulse quickened. He looked over at Monroe, whose face had paled considerably. "It's the house," Monroe muttered. "It's trying to mess with our heads." As they neared a large oak door at the end of the hall, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. Ryder hesitated, his hand hovering over the doorknob. He could feel the malevolence radiating from beyond the door, as though something ancient and dark waited on the other side. "Do we open it?" Monroe asked, gripping his flashlight with white knuckles. His voice wavered as the whispers grew into unsettling chants. "We don't have a choice," Ryder said, steeling himself. "We need to find Cole." With a deep breath, Ryder turned the knob and pushed the door open. The room beyond was pitch black, save for the faint outline of furniture and what appeared to be a large, broken mirror at the far end. Ryder shone his flashlight into the room, and the beam caught something in the corner. A figure crouching low, its back hunched, hands twisted unnaturally. "Is that?" Monroe whispered, taking a step forward. Suddenly, the figure snapped its head toward them, revealing a face twisted in agony and terror. It was Cole, his eyes wide, his mouth moving silently as if he were trapped in a nightmare. His body jerked and convulsed, as though something invisible was controlling him. "Ryder! Monroe!" Cole's voice came out in a hoarse whisper, but it was laced with panic. "Help me, I can't move." Before Ryder could react, the mirror behind Cole began to crack, spiderwebbing from the center. A cold gust of wind whipped through the room, and the air grew thick with the scent of decay. Monroe rushed forward to pull Cole away from the mirror, but the moment his hand touched him, the ground beneath them trembled violently. The mirror shattered, sending shards of glass flying through the air, and from its center, a dark, shadowy figure emerged. It was the shadowman again, its eyes glowing red, its form twisting in the darkness like smoke. "Run!" Ryder yelled, grabbing Monroe by the arm and dragging him backward as the shadowman advanced, its hollow eyes fixed on them. The figure stepped forward, its hand reaching out, and suddenly the floorboards buckled. Long skeletal hands burst from the floor, grabbing at their legs, pulling them down. The house was alive, and it wanted them. The walls of the Taylor house pulsed and groaned as though the entire structure were a living, breathing entity. Ryder and Monroe stumbled down the narrow staircase, panting as the whispers in the house grew louder, more malicious. "We need to get out of here," Monroe gasped, clutching his injured arm. Just as Ryder turned the corner, the walls trembled violently, and a loud scratching sound echoed through the air. It was no ordinary noise. It was coming from within the walls, as if something was clawing its way through the very wood and plaster. "Not more of them," Ryder muttered, backing up as the scratching intensified. Then, out of nowhere, the wallpaper began to tear itself apart, revealing long, jagged cracks in the walls. From within those cracks, pale, twisted forms emerged, crawlers. Their elongated limbs and eyeless faces were enough to turn Ryder's stomach. "Ryder, they're everywhere," Monroe shouted, raising his flashlight to illuminate the creatures as they spilled out, their gnarled hands reaching for them. The crawlers moved in a jerking, unnatural way, their bones snapping and cracking with each movement. Ryder swung the iron rod wildly, hitting one of the creatures in the skull with a sickening crunch, but more kept coming, their hollow mouths opening in silent screams. "Go! Up the stairs!" Ryder shouted, pushing Monroe ahead as he swung the rod again, knocking a crawler back into the dark. They bolted up the staircase, but the crawlers were relentless, scaling the walls and ceiling like grotesque spiders. Ryder felt something cold and slimy wrap around his ankle, pulling him down. He turned to see one of the creatures dragging itself up his leg, its bony fingers digging into his skin. "Ryder!" Monroe yelled, rushing back and kicking the creature off with a sickening thud. It tumbled down the stairs, but more crawlers swarmed up behind it. They reached the top of the stairs and slammed the door shut behind them, barricading it with a heavy dresser. The scratching continued on the other side, the crawlers trying to force their way in. "This place is a nightmare," Monroe said, breathless. "And it's getting worse," Ryder replied, his face grim. "That thing, whatever it is, wants us dead, and it's using everything in this house to make sure of it." They had no time to rest. The house was awake, and they were running out of time. The walls groaned again, louder this time, as if the entire house was closing in around them. Ryder and Monroe stood in the middle of the room, their backs pressed against the heavy dresser they'd pushed against the door. The relentless scratching and pounding on the other side made their skin crawl. "We can't stay here," Monroe whispered, his breath coming in shallow gasps. His eyes darted around the room, searching for any possible exit. Ryder nodded, his mind racing. The house was turning into a maze of horror. Crawlers, shadowmen, and now something far worse was at play. The air felt thicker, oppressive. A sense of dread clung to every surface, seeping into their bones. Suddenly, a low growl echoed from the corner of the room. Ryder's flashlight flickered as it caught the shadow of something hulking, crouched low to the ground. "What's that?" Monroe muttered, taking a step back, his heart racing. Out of the shadows, a figure emerged. But this was no ordinary crawler. Its body was twisted and misshapen, limbs unnaturally long, with glowing red eyes set deep into its skull-like face. It moved with a jerky, unnatural speed, its claws scraping along the floor. "Go!" Ryder shouted, yanking Monroe toward the window. They crashed through the glass just as the creature lunged, its claws missing them by inches. The fall to the ground below knocked the wind out of them, but they scrambled to their feet, adrenaline pumping. The house seemed to vibrate with rage, the very ground beneath them trembling. "Where do we go?" Monroe panted, his hand clutching a bleeding gash on his arm. Ryder scanned the area, his flashlight bouncing off the trees that loomed around them. Beyond the house was an old shed, its roof caved in and walls covered in thick, twisting vines. "There," Ryder pointed. "It's our only option." They sprinted toward the shed, the air around them thickening with the presence of something malevolent. Just as they reached the door, it swung open on its own, revealing darkness beyond. They hesitated for a second, but the sound of the creatures behind them left no room for doubt. They dashed inside, slamming the door shut, but the shed offered no solace. As the door clicked shut, the air grew colder, freezing. Their breath came out in foggy clouds, and the hairs on the back of Ryder's neck stood on end. "That's not good," Monroe muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. From the shadows, they heard it, a soft, almost playful giggle that sent shivers down their spines. The flashlight flickered again, and for a split second, Ryder saw it. Standing in the far corner, bathed in shadow, was a figure, a woman, her face twisted in an unnatural grin, her eyes wide and unblinking. What the hell is that?" Monroe stammered, backing up against the wall. Before Ryder could answer, the woman's head snapped toward them with a sickening crack, and she began to move, her body jerking and twisting as if pulled by invisible strings. "She's not real," Ryder whispered, but he wasn't convincing even himself. The woman lunged, her mouth open in a silent scream. Ryder grabbed a rusted pipe lying on the ground and swung, but it passed through her as if she were smoke. She dissolved into darkness, but the temperature continued to drop, and the giggling returned, echoing from all around them. "We need to leave," Monroe shouted, his voice shaking, but the door wouldn't budge. They were trapped. Ryder and Monroe fought against the growing terror, frantically pulling at the door. But the house had them in its grip, and it wasn't going to let them go. Then the giggling stopped. For a brief, suffocating moment, everything was silent. The air itself seemed to hold its breath, and then the walls began to move. At first, it was subtle, a slow creak, a shift in the wooden beams. But it quickly escalated. The entire structure of the shed twisted and contorted, as if the house were coming to life. The floor beneath them buckled, sending both men tumbling backward. "What is happening?" Monroe gasped, his eyes wide with panic. Ryder didn't answer. His mind was racing, trying to make sense of the madness around them. But there was no logic here. The house was more than just haunted. It was alive, and it was hungry. Suddenly, the door burst open, but not by their hands. A figure stood in the doorway, a shadow tall and imposing, with glowing red eyes. It was the Shadowman, larger and more terrifying than before, its form now solid and crackling with energy. Without warning, it charged. Ryder shoved Monroe aside as the Shadowman barreled into the shed, its clawed hands swinging wildly. Ryder barely managed to dodge, but the force of the attack sent him crashing into the wall. Monroe screamed as the Shadowman turned its attention toward him, its glowing eyes narrowing. But then something changed. The ground trembled violently, and from the depths of the earth beneath the shed, a massive crack appeared. From that crack, more shadowy figures emerged, demons, crawlers, and things far worse. The house had summoned its army. "We're not going to make it," Monroe whispered, his voice trembling with fear. Ryder picked up the rusted pipe again, his hands shaking. He knew they were outnumbered, but he wasn't going down without a fight. As the creatures swarmed, the house groaned with delight. It had them trapped in its twisted embrace. And the last thing they heard before the darkness closed in around them was the sound of laughter, echoing, mocking, and endless.